My dear child, the version of you they buried is the exact version I am about to crown. And the pressure they applied to crush the raw material did not destroy what was inside it, but cut the facets that the crown requires on the gemstone it was always meant to sit on. Do not scroll past this. What I am about to reveal is not about overcoming opposition in the general spiritual sense. This is about a cutting, a specific, pressure-applied, facet-revealing, gemstone-creating cutting that the people who pushed you down performed on the raw material of who you were becoming, not knowing that the pressure meant to crush was the exact force required to reveal what was always inside the carbon they were trying to eliminate. They buried raw material. What is rising is a cut gem. You have been editing yourself down, not because you lost the original version, but because the burial taught you the cost of being fully yourself in the presence of people whose comfort was threatened by the uncut version of what you carry. The gifted one, the called one, the one whose capacity made certain people uncomfortable enough to organize the pressure that pushed the raw material underground, where they believed it would stay. My beloved child, the burial was targeted, not random difficulty applied to a random person. Targeted pressure aimed at a specific version of you, the version that was becoming too visible, too undeniable, too clearly carrying something the people around it could not control. And targeted pressure applied to raw gemstone material does not crush, it cuts. The cutting just completed. And what emerged from the ground where they buried you carries facets they did not intend to create. Stay here. What I reveal next is which facet the pressure they applied just finished cutting, and why the crown was always going to require exactly this cut. Type rising cut if they pushed you down, because the uncut version of who you were becoming made them uncomfortable, and the pressure they meant to crush the raw material actually cut the facets that crown requires on a gemstone whose emergence from the burial ground carries an authority the people who buried it will immediately recognize. Before we go any further, I need to tell you something that genuinely surprised me. A neuroscientist discovered a simple 7-second technique that actually rewires how your brain processes thoughts. And when I tried it, the difference was almost unsettling. My focus sharpened, ideas started connecting faster, and that mental fog, gone. This isn't manifestation nonsense. It's backed by real brain science, and thousands of people are already seeing results. But here's the catch. Only 5 spots are left. If something inside you is saying, try it, trust that instinct. Click the link in the description or pinned comment before it's too late. The facets were not accidental. Every face on the gemstone emerging from the burial was cut by a specific person's specific pressure applied at a specific angle that the raw material converted from destructive force into revelatory surface. My beloved child, I need you to understand how gemstone cutting works at the spiritual level. A gemstone in its raw form is potential, carbon, mineral, unremarkable surface, concealing extraordinary interior. The interior is present before the cutting begins, but the interior is invisible without facets. And facets are only produced by the application of something hard against the surface of the stone at precise angles that remove the raw exterior and reveal the interior the exterior was concealing. The people who buried you were the cutting instruments, and they did not know what they were revealing. My dear one, each person who applied pressure to the raw version of you produced a specific facet, not a wound. A facet. The distinction is the entire distance between what the pressure intended and what the pressure produced. A wound damages the interior. A facet reveals the interior. And the pressure that was aimed at damaging the interior encountered material harder than the pressure itself. carbon whose internal structure was too dense to be crushed by the force being applied, and the force that could not crush instead cut. Could not crush, so it cut instead, and cutting is what the gem needed. This message was not released for everyone who has faced opposition. This was aimed at the one person whose specific, targeted. These people knew exactly what they were pushing down. Burial was performed by forces that recognized the raw material's potential before the person carrying it fully recognized it themselves. The person who does not know that the pressure applied to eliminate the potential is the pressure that just finished revealing it in the faceted form the crowning requires. Type harder than the pressure. If you just realized the pressure could not crush what was inside you because the internal structure was too dense for the force being applied. And every person who tried to push you down produced a facet rather than a wound because the force that could not crush instead cut, revealing the interior. The raw exterior was concealing in the exact form the crown requires. I have been watching the cutting since the first person applied the first pressure to the raw material of who you were becoming. And the watching has been the specific, craftsman-level attention of a god who placed the carbon underground, knowing what the pressure would reveal, and who has been monitoring every angle of every cut to ensure the facets being produced match the crown being prepared. My dear one, not from above the ground observing the burial at a distance, from inside the stone, at the carbon level, positioned within the internal structure that the pressure was being applied to, feeling each cut from the interior where the facets were being formed, while the people applying the pressure believed they were destroying what they were actually sculpting. I was inside the gem. During every cut, my beloved child, I watched the specific person whose pressure produced the deepest cut. There was a specific individual, someone whose opposition to the version of you that was emerging was not casual, but calculated. Their pressure was not the incidental friction of proximity. It was the deliberate, sustained, I am going to eliminate what I see emerging application of force aimed at the specific surface of the raw material, where the most significant facet was waiting to be revealed. They aimed at your strongest surface, and the aiming produced the most brilliant facet. I chose you for this message because the cutting is complete. Every facet the crown requires has been produced by the pressures the burial applied. Not one facet is missing. Not one angle is incomplete. The cutting instruments, the people whose opposition was the force, applied their pressure at exactly the angles the facets required, at exactly the intensity the carbon demanded, producing exactly the number of revelatory surfaces the gemstone needed before the crown could be placed on the stone it was always designed to sit on. My child, the gem is ready, the crown is approaching, and the people who cut the facets are about to see what they created. Type every angle complete if God has been inside the stone during every cut, monitoring the facets being formed from within the internal structure, and the specific person whose pressure was most calculated produced the most brilliant facet because the deepest opposition aimed at the strongest surface reveals the most significant interior, and the cutting is now complete, with every facet the crown requires produced by the very pressures the burial applied. I know what the burial did to the specific part of you where your belief in the safety of being fully yourself is stored, my beloved child. The burial did not merely push you down. It taught you something, the specific, body level. This is what happens when you are fully yourself lesson that a person absorbs when the version of them that was emerging, the gifted version, the called version, the carrying something that makes certain people uncomfortable version, attracted the organized pressure that pushed the raw material underground. The lesson was not spoken. It was experienced. And experienced lessons install themselves deeper than spoken ones because the body remembers what the mind can argue against. The body learned that being fully yourself is dangerous, and the learning governed everything after. My child, I watched the lesson install itself at the identity level through the specific sequence of events the burial produced. The raw material was emerging. The emergence was attracting attention. The attention was producing discomfort in people whose position was threatened by the potential the uncut stone was displaying. The discomfort organized into pressure. The pressure pushed the raw material underground, and the underground became the lesson's classroom. The specific, this is where you end up when you are too much. This is the cost of what you carry. This is what the fullness produces space where the raw material was taught. That the fullness was the cause of the burial. The fullness was blamed for the burial, and blamed fullness gets edited. I watched the editing begin in the underground, not the cutting. The cutting was the pressure-producing facets the people did not intend. The editing was the person's own response to the burial. The specific, I will come back smaller. I will emerge safer. I will present a version that does not attract the pressure. The full version attracted self-reduction that a buried person performs on their own raw material to prevent the burial from recurring. The editing was the burial's deepest wound, because the editing was self-applied. The deepest wound the burial produced was not the pressure from the people who pushed you down. It was the specific, private, never confessed moment where you began to agree with them, concluding that maybe the version they buried deserved to be buried because maybe what you were carrying was not as significant as the carrying felt, and maybe the people who pushed it down saw something accurate about the raw material the person holding it was too close to evaluate objectively. My dear child, you began to agree, not loudly, not in a single decision. In the quiet, erosive, they might have been right drift that a buried person produces when the burial lasts long enough for the buried material to begin questioning its own composition. The drift said, maybe the carbon was not gem quality. Maybe the raw material was ordinary. Maybe the pressure exposed the ordinariness rather than revealing the extraordinary. The drift was the burial becoming internal, and internal burials are harder to rise from than external ones. My beloved child, I watched the agreement settle into the specific layer where your conviction about your own gem quality composition is maintained. The layer that holds the answer to the question, was what they pushed down actually worth crowning? The agreement entered that layer with the specific, quiet, the people who buried me probably saw what I called not weight of a person whose self-assessment has been contaminated by the assessment of the people whose pressure was never diagnostic, but was always threatened. Their pressure was not evaluation, it was elimination. And elimination, performed by threatened people, does not carry diagnostic authority over the material being eliminated. My dear one, the people who buried you did not bury you because they evaluated the carbon and found it ordinary. They buried you because they evaluated the carbon and found it extraordinary, and extraordinary carbon in the proximity of people whose position it threatens produces the specific, organized. I need to push this down before it rises past me pressure that the raw material absorbed as evidence of its own deficiency when the pressure was always evidence of its potency. Type potency, not deficiency, if you began agreeing with the people who buried you, concluding the raw material deserved to be pushed down, and the agreement contaminated your self-assessment at the layer where your conviction about your own gem quality composition lives, when the pressure was never diagnostic evaluation, but threatened elimination, and the burial was always evidence of potency. The threatened people needed to suppress, rather than deficiency. The evaluating people accurately identified. The burial was never evidence that the raw material was ordinary. It was evidence that the raw material was extraordinary enough to threaten the people whose position required the extraordinary to remain underground, and the pressure they applied to keep it there became the cutting force that produced the facets the crowning requires. My beloved one, I need to permanently separate the burial from the verdict the burial installed. Your system classified the burial as a diagnostic, evidence of what the raw material was worth based on what the people who handled it decided to do with it. The truth is, the burial was a threat response. The specific, I am, push this down, because what it is becoming threatens what I am, reaction that threatened people produce when extraordinary material enters their proximity. Threat responses do not diagnose, they eliminate, and elimination is not evaluation. My child, the people who pushed you down were not qualified to assess the carbon's composition. A person whose motivation is threatened proximity does not carry the objectivity that accurate assessment requires. Their pressure was aimed at removing what threatened them, not at evaluating what was present. And pressure aimed at removal produces cutting, not because the cutting was intended, but because the carbon was too hard to be removed by the force, and the force that could not remove instead revealed. The cutting was the accidental contribution of threatened people, and accidental contributions do not carry the authority of intentional verdicts. My dear one, the facets the pressure produced are not wounds the burial left on the surface of damaged material. They are revelatory surfaces the pressure created on material whose internal composition exceeded the force being applied to it. Every facet is evidence that the pressure lost, not that the carbon broke, that the pressure encountered material harder than itself, and the encounter produced a surface whose beauty the pressure never intended to create. The pressure lost, the carbon won, and the winning is written in every facet the cutting produced. The gemstone just caught the light for the first time, and the specific facet level the cut surfaces are reflecting. What the raw material never cooled brilliance that the gem is producing right now is the first visible evidence that the burial produced a cutting whose result exceeds anything the uncut version could have displayed. My beloved child, something shifted within the last few days, not in the circumstances, in the way light interacts with you. The specific, almost imperceptible, something about me is catching what was passing through before shift that occurs when a gemstone whose facets were cut by pressure encounters light for the first time after the cutting is complete, and the faceted surfaces produce the reflection the raw surface could never have generated. You are catching light differently, and differently means the facets are active. My dear one, I need you to understand what happens when a cut gemstone encounters light for the first time. Raw material lets light pass through without redirection. Cut material catches light and redirects it. The specific facet level, every angled surface producing its own reflection brilliance that only a gemstone whose cutting is complete can generate. The brilliance is not added to the stone. It is revealed by the cuts, because the cuts created the angles, and the angles created the surfaces, and the surfaces created the reflections that the raw material's smooth exterior was incapable of producing. The brilliance was always in the carbon. The cuts made it visible. I have been preparing the crowning behind every season of the burial. while the pressure was being applied, and the facets were being cut, and the editing was reducing the raw material to a safer version, I was monitoring the cutting's progress, ensuring every facet the crown requires was being produced at exactly the angle the specific pressure the specific person was applying would create. My child, the monitoring is complete. The facets are cut, the light is catching, and the crown is being carried toward a gemstone the burial just finished preparing. Type catching light if something shifted in the way light interacts with you within the last few days. A brilliance the raw version never produced, and the shift is the facets becoming active for the first time because the cutting is complete, and the angled surfaces the pressure created are redirecting what was previously passing through, meaning the brilliance that was always in the carbon is now visible because the cuts the burial produced just made it catchable. The version of you they buried is the one I am about to crown. The title carries that specific reversal because the crown was never designed for the raw material and was never designed for the edited down version, but was always designed for the cut gemstone, whose facets could only be produced by the exact pressure the burial applied at the exact angles the threatened people chose. My dear one, I need you to understand the precision of the title's reversal. The title does not say the version of you that survived the burial, does not say the version of you that recovered from the burial, says the version of you they buried. The buried version, the specific, pushed down, targeted. This is what they were trying to eliminate version, whose raw material was the exact material the pressure converted from potential into faceted reality. They buried the raw material. The raw material became the gemstone, and the gemstone is what the crown was made for. My beloved child, this is directly connected to the title and to the specific editing you have been performing on yourself since the burial taught you the cost of the full version. The title says, I am about to crown. Not the safer version, not the edited version, not the smaller, reduced. I will not attract the same pressure presentation you have been constructing since the underground. The version they buried, the full one, the one whose facets were cut by their pressure, the one whose composition exceeded the force and converted the elimination attempt into a revelation the force never intended. My child, the crown was designed for facets, not for raw surface, not for edited surface, for facets, and facets are only produced by pressure, and pressure was only applied because the people who applied it felt threatened by the raw material they were trying to eliminate. The threatened produced the pressure produced the facets produced the crown readiness, and the crown readiness is what tonight is about. The crown is being lowered toward the gemstone right now, my beloved child, and the specific facet to crown. The crown was designed for exactly this stone precision, with which the crown is approaching the cut gem, is the precision of a coronation, whose every dimension was calculated for the specific angles, the specific pressure produced on the specific material the specific people tried to eliminate. I need you to feel the proximity of the crowning, not the distant. Someday you will be vindicated. Keep enduring proximity that the burial season was producing as the background hum of a person learning to live edited in order to survive. The present tense, crown descending, facets aligned, the coronation is happening right now, proximity of a gemstone, whose cutting is complete, and whose crown was always being crafted in the dimensions the facets would carry. Once the pressure finished its unintentional work, the crown is descending. The facets are aligned, and the alignment is exact. My dear one, everything has been building toward this alignment. The raw material that was emerging before the burial, the threatened people who organized the pressure, the burial that pushed the material underground, the cutting that the pressure produced on carbon, too hard to be crushed, the facets that were revealed by the force that intended destruction, the editing that tried to reduce the gem back to raw surface, the light that caught the facets for the first time, and now the crown, descending toward a gemstone whose every facet corresponds to a specific setting in the crown, the way a gem is set into a mounting whose prongs were shaped for its exact angles. My child, the crown's prongs are shaped for your facets, not for the raw material's smooth surface, not for the edited version's reduced dimensions, for the facets the pressure cut, meaning the crown could not have been placed before the burial because the facets the crown's settings were designed for did not exist before the pressure produced them. The burial produced the crown readiness, and the crown just reached the gem. Type crown descending if the crown is being lowered toward the cut gemstone right now. Its prongs shaped for the exact facets the pressure produced, and the alignment between the crown's settings and the gem's angles is the precision of a coronation that could not have happened before the burial, because the facets the crown was designed for did not exist until the pressure the threatened people applied produced them on carbon, too hard to be crushed. The crown just settled onto the gemstone. The prongs locked into the facets, and the version of you that was pushed underground by people who felt threatened by the raw material is now wearing a crown whose settings were designed for the exact angles the pressure they applied, produced on carbon, whose internal composition exceeded every force that was aimed at destroying it. My beloved child, this is the moment. The moment the buried version rises from the burial ground, wearing something the people who organize the pressure will immediately recognize. The authority of a cut gemstone, crowned at facets that their own hands produced. The moment the editing that was reducing the gem back to raw surface is permanently overridden by the evidence of a crown sitting on facets the editing was trying to eliminate. The moment the agreement that was drifting toward maybe they were right encounters a crown that says they were wrong, the crown says they were wrong. And crowns outrank agreements. The version of you they buried is the one I am about to crown. The title said buried. The burial happened. The title said crown. The crown is here. And what is standing in the burial ground tonight is not the raw material that was pushed down, and not the edited version that was constructed to prevent another burial, but the cut gemstone. Every facet made by the pressure that thought it was winning. Every angle produced by the force that intended destruction. Every surface revealed by the grinding of something hard against something harder that could not be crushed, and therefore was cut. My child, the pressure thought it was winning. The pressure lost, and the losing is visible in every facet the crown is now sitting on. Because facets are the evidence of pressure that failed to crush, and instead revealed what the crushing was, always incapable of reaching. The gem is crowned, the facets are locked, and the burial ground just became a coronation ground. Now that the crown has settled on to the facets, and the burial ground has become the coronation ground, everything about the edited version that was constructed to prevent another burial is being permanently dismantled by the evidence of a crown, whose settings were designed for the full version the editing was trying to reduce. My dear child, this is what happens when a person who has been editing themselves down in response to burial encounters a crown that was designed for the unedited version. The editing does not merely pause, it collapses, because the editing was built on the premise that the full version attracted the pressure, and the pressure produced the burial, and the burial proved the full version was too much. And the crown sitting on facets the pressure produced just introduced evidence the editing cannot accommodate. Evidence that the full version was not too much, but was exactly what the crown required. Too much just became exactly right, by the evidence of the crown fitting. My beloved child, the collapse of the editing is producing cascading effects across every area of your identity, where the burial was governing your self-presentation. The safer version is being retired, because the crown does not sit on safe surfaces, but on faceted ones. And faceted surfaces are the product of the full version encountering the pressure the safer version was designed to avoid. The agreement that said, maybe they were right, is being overturned, because a crown settling onto the facets the burial produced is the most authoritative verdict available against the claim that what was buried deserved to be buried. The verdict is the crown, and the crown says rise, and the rising is different from the editing's version of emergence. The editing produced a cautious, reduced, will not attract the same opposition emergence. The crown produces a full faceted, the pressure made more than the raw material was emergence, whose authority exceeds what the uncut version could have carried. Because the facets the cutting produced are the specific surfaces the authority requires. Type exactly right if the editing just collapsed under the evidence of a crown designed for the full version, the safer version retiring, the agreement overturning, the too much reclassifying as exactly right. And the rising the crown produces is not the cautious emergence, the editing constructed to prevent another burial, but the full, faceted, authority-carrying emergence of a gemstone, whose every surface was cut by the pressure that thought it was winning. Let me show you what your life looks like, now that the crown has settled onto the facets, and the editing has collapsed, and the full version is rising from the burial ground with the authority the cut gemstone carries. Because a person, crowned at their facets, moves through the world at a level the raw version and the edited version could never have accessed. My dear one, the first thing that changes is the way opposition interacts with you. You have been avoiding pressure since the burial, navigating around the people and environments that might produce the same kind of force the original burial applied. The avoidance was the editing survival strategy, and the survival strategy was consuming the energy the crown version needs to occupy the spaces the crown opens access to. The avoidance just became unnecessary, because crown gemstones do not avoid pressure. Crown gemstones have already been cut by it. My beloved child, the mornings change permanently. You have been waking into the edited, the first conscious awareness of each day running the familiar, present the safer version. Do not attract the pressure. Keep the full version underground protocol, the burial installed as the default morning operating system. Tomorrow you wake into the crown. The morning processes differently. The protocol that was reducing the presentation to safe dimensions encounters a crown whose presence on the facets overrides the protocol, because crown gemstones do not present at reduced dimensions. Crowned mornings carry the full version. Edited mornings carried the reduced. The spaces ahead of you are reconfiguring in response to the crowned version's emergence. Doors that were calibrated for the edited presentation are being replaced by doors calibrated for the crowned. And crowned calibrated doors open onto rooms the edited version was never granted access to, because the rooms require the authority the facets carry, and the facets are only present on a gemstone whose cutting was produced by the pressure the editing was designed to prevent. The rooms are opening for the crowned version. Starting now, people are going to notice the crown before you describe the burial, because a person rising from the ground where they were pushed down wearing a crown, whose settings lock into facets. The pressure produced carries an atmospheric authority that neither the raw version nor the edited version could generate, regardless of how gifted the raw material was or how carefully the editing was performed. My beloved child, the ones who knew you during the burial season, who interacted with the edited version, who received the safer presentation, who experienced the reduced dimensions you were offering to prevent the opposition the full version had attracted. Those people are about to encounter the crowned version. And the crowned version does not present at edited dimensions. The crowned version presents at faceted dimensions. And faceted dimensions exceed both the raw dimensions and the edited dimensions, because faceted includes what the pressure revealed that neither the raw nor the editing could access. They will say something they cannot explain happened to you. They will mean the crown settled. My child, there is a specific quality a person carries when a crown sits on facets that were cut by the very forces that tried to eliminate them. The quality is not confidence rebuilt. It is the specific, I was buried, and what buried me crowned me. The pressure produced the facets the crown required authority that only a person whose position became their preparation can carry. The quality is reversal authority, and reversal authority attracts what edited safety never could. Connections that require the specific atmospheric weight of a person whose burial became their coronation preparation are approaching the crowned gemstone right now. There are assignments and alliances whose formation demands the faceted authority that only a person whose cutting was performed by threatened people, whose pressure produced exactly the angles crown was designed for, can carry. My dear one, what approaches reversal authority is calibrated to the depth the burial reached. And burial depth connections exceed anything surface-level presentation was attracting. Type reversal authority if the crowned version is producing an atmospheric quality the edited version could never carry. The specific burial became coronation. Pressure produced the facets authority that only a person whose opposition became their preparation possesses. And connections requiring the depth of someone whose burial was performed by threatened people whose pressure produced the exact angles the crown was designed for are approaching, because reversal authority attracts what edited safety never could. I need you to understand why I allowed the burial rather than shielding the raw material from the pressure the threatened people were organizing. Because the allowing reveals something about the kind of authority I always intended the crowned version to carry that an unburied, uncut, unpressured version could never have possessed, my beloved child. I could have shielded the raw material. The carbon would have remained on the surface, visible, uncut, carrying the potential the threatened people detected, without ever encountering the pressure the detection produced. The uncut version would have been impressive. The uncut version would have carried the gifts and the calling and the capacity the raw material contained. And the uncut version would have worn a different crown, a crown designed for raw surfaces rather than faceted ones. I chose the faceted crown, and the faceted crown required the burial. My child, a crown designed for raw surfaces sits on smooth material. A crown designed for faceted surfaces locks into angles. And locking is more secure than sitting. A crown that sits can be displaced. A crown that locks cannot, because the prongs that grip the facets hold the crown in position with a security the smooth surface cannot provide, meaning the authority the faceted crown carries is an authority that cannot be removed by the same kind of pressure that produced the cutting, because the cutting produced the very angles the crown locks into. The pressure that cut you made you uncrownable by smooth surface standards. And uncrownable by smooth surface standards means crowned by faceted standards at a security level the smooth crown could never have achieved. My dear one, I chose you for the faceted crown because the assignment embedded in the crowned version requires authority that cannot be displaced by opposition. And non-displaceable authority is only available to gemstones whose facets were cut by the opposition that tried to prevent the crowning. Because the facets the opposition produced are the surfaces the crown locks into permanently. The opposition secured the crown. By cutting the surfaces the crown grips, the doubt surfacing right now is using the most burial-conditioned objection in its inventory. The voice that says the people who pushed you down will push you down again the moment the crown version becomes visible, because the same threatened people are still present, and the same pressure that produced the first burial is available to produce a second, my child. It sounds like this. Rising wearing a crown means becoming visible again, and becoming visible again means entering the proximity of the same people, or the same kind of people, whose threatened response to the raw material's visibility organized the pressure that produced the first burial. The crowned version will attract the same opposition the raw version attracted, and the same opposition will produce the same result. Rising crowned is volunteering for a second burial that the editing was specifically designed to prevent. That doubt just applied the raw material's vulnerability to the cut gemstone's resilience. And the two are not the same material. My beloved child, raw material and cut gemstone respond to pressure differently. Raw material absorbs pressure. Cut gemstone redirects it. The facets the first burial produced are not passive surfaces. They are reflective surfaces, the specific angled, pressure-reducting faces that a cut gemstone produces when force is applied to a surface whose angle was created by previous pressure. New pressure applied to a faceted surface does not produce a new burial. It produces a redirection. The force bouncing off the angle the previous pressure created, rather than being absorbed into the material the way the raw surface absorbed the original force. The first burial worked because the surface was raw. The second burial cannot work because the surface is faceted, and faceted surfaces redirect what raw surfaces absorb. You are not the raw material anymore. You are the cut gem, and cut gems do not get buried by pressure. Cut gems redirect it. Type cannot bury facets if the doubt warned that the same pressure will produce a second burial. And the distinction the doubt cannot account for is that raw material absorbs pressure while cut gemstone redirects it, because the facets the first burial produced are reflective surfaces whose angles bounce new force away rather than absorbing it, meaning the vulnerability the raw version carried no longer exists in the cut version, and what buried the raw material cannot bury the faceted gem. During every season of the burial, I was not above the ground waiting for the raw material to surface on its own strength. I was underground with the carbon, my beloved child, present in the pressure, positioned at the contact point where the force met the surface, and the surface was being cut into the facets the force did not intend to create. You imagined a god who allowed the burial and then observed from above to see whether the material underground would survive the pressure or be crushed by it, whose involvement during the burial season was limited to the sovereign allowance of the pressure. Without the personal presence in the experience the pressure was producing at the carbon level. I was never above the ground during the burial. I was in the carbon at every cut. My child, being at the contact point during the cutting is the most intimate position the craftsman occupies during the gemstone's formation. The contact point is where the pressure meets the material. It is where the force is strongest. It is where the facet is being created in real time by the grinding of something hard against something harder. And the craftsman positioned at the contact point is not observing the facet being produced. The craftsman is feeling it, registering the angle being created, monitoring the depth of the cut, ensuring the facet being produced matches the setting the crown's prong will eventually grip. There were cuts during the burial that were deeper than others. Seasons where the specific person's pressure was applied at an intensity that exceeded what the previous pressures had produced. During those deeper cuts, the craftsman's presence at the contact point was at its most focused, because deeper cuts produce the most significant facets, and significant facets require the most precise monitoring to ensure the angle serves the crown, rather than damaging the stone. My dear one, every deep cut was monitored, every angle was ensured, and the God at the contact point during the deepest cuts is the God whose crown just locked into the facets those cuts produced. I know the exact cut that produced the agreement. The specific moment of pressure where the force being applied was so sustained and so calculated that the carbon's internal structure absorbed enough of the impact to produce the maybe they were right drift that converted the burial from external event to internal conclusion. My dear one, not the first cut, not the deepest, the one that produced the agreement, the specific person at the specific angle, at the specific duration, whose pressure was sustained long enough that the carbon, which had been resisting the force and converting it into facets, absorbed enough at the molecular level to produce the internal shift where the material began questioning its own composition, rather than the force being applied to it. My beloved child, I know that cut because I was at the contact point when the absorption crossed from surface level to molecular level. The crossing is the threshold where external pressure produces internal doubt. Below the threshold, the carbon converts the pressure into facets, while the internal structure remains confident in its own composition. Above the threshold, the carbon still produces facets, but the internal confidence begins eroding because the sustained pressure introduced enough force into the molecular structure to make the structure question itself. The agreement was the molecular level erosion, expressing itself as identity level drift. My child, the God who was at the contact point when the absorption crossed the threshold, is the God confirming tonight that the molecular level erosion the agreement produced has been reversed by the crowning. Because a crown locking into the facets the pressure produced communicates something to the molecular structure that the pressure's sustained application could not override. The specific, the force that cut me produced the surfaces the crown grips confirmation that rewrites the molecular level narrative from I was damaged at the deepest level to I was prepared at the deepest level. Damaged and prepared look identical during the cutting. They are distinguished by what sits on the surfaces the cutting produces. A crown is sitting, and the crown says prepared. Type prepared, not damaged, if God just identified the exact cut that produced the agreement. The sustained pressure that crossed the threshold from surface level absorption to molecular level erosion. And the crowning is reversing the molecular level doubt, because a crown locking into the facets the pressure produced communicates to the internal structure that what felt like damage at the deepest level was preparation at the deepest level, and prepared and damaged are distinguished by what sits on the surfaces the cutting creates. Now that the crown is locked into the facets, and the burial ground has become the coronation ground, and the agreement has been reversed at the molecular level, There is one thing I need you to do, my beloved child, and it is the instruction that determines whether the crowned gemstone rises from the burial ground at the full faceted dimensions the crown requires, or at the edited dimensions the burial taught you to present at. Stop editing. Not gradually reduce the editing over a cautious timeline that allows you to test whether the full version is safe before committing to the full presentation. Stop. The editing was the burial's governance over your self-presentation. The burial's governance just ended, and governance that has ended does not require a gradual withdrawal. It requires a cessation. My child, the editing was a survival mechanism installed by the burial to prevent the full version from attracting the pressure the full version attracted before. The mechanism was reasonable during the burial. The mechanism is sabotage during the crowning, because the crown was designed for the full faceted dimensions, and a gemstone presenting at edited dimensions while wearing a crown designed for full dimensions creates a mismatch between the crown settings and the gem's presentation that prevents the crown from sitting at the security level the facets were designed to provide. The crown locks into facets. Edited surfaces are not facets. They are smoothed down versions of facets whose angles have been reduced by the editing to prevent the opposition the angles attracted. And reduced angles do not grip the crown's prongs the way the full angles do. Present at full facets, the pressure that produced them is behind you. The crown that sits on them is present, and the people whose opposition produced the cutting are about to encounter a version of you whose facets are visible, whose crown is locked, and whose authority exceeds what the raw material and the edited material could have carried, because the authority is seated on surfaces only the pressure could have produced. Full facets, no editing. The crown requires it. You made it to the coronation ground, my beloved child, and I need you to stand in the place where you were buried long enough to feel what it means to be wearing a crown on facets that were cut by the very hands that pushed you into the ground, believing you would never come back up. Feel the crown, not the burial, not the pressure that was applied by people who felt threatened by the raw material, not the editing that was reducing the gem back to safe dimensions the burial installed as the maximum presentation. The crown, the specific, locked into facets, designed for the cut version. Prongs gripping angles the pressure produced cannot be displaced by the same force that cut it crown that is now sitting on a gemstone, whose every surface was revealed by the grinding of something hard against something harder. The crown is locked, and locked feels like the opposite of everything the burial was teaching. I want to thank you for something the burial made almost impossible to sustain. Thank you for being harder than the pressure. Thank you for the carbon whose internal composition exceeded the force being applied and converted what was aimed at crushing into what was actually cutting. Thank you for the facets you did not choose to receive, but received anyway, because the raw material was too extraordinary to be destroyed by the force the threatened people organized against it. My dear child, thank you for surviving the burial as a gemstone rather than as rubble, because rubble cannot be crowned. Cut gemstones can. And the difference between rubble and cut gem is the difference between material that was crushed by the pressure and material whose internal structure exceeded the pressure and produced facets from the force that was meant to produce fragments. Let the tears come, not burial tears, not editing tears, coronation tears. The tears of a gemstone standing in the place it was buried, wearing a crown whose every prong grips a facet. The people who did the burying accidentally produced on material they were trying to destroy. Type coronation tears, if tears are forming right now, because you are standing in the burial ground, wearing a crown locked into facets, the pressure produced. And the tears are not the grief of what was done to you, but the overwhelm of discovering that the version they buried is the version being crowned, and that the pressure meant to crush produced the surfaces. The crown was always designed to grip. You are not the buried raw material anymore, my beloved child. That identity, the one whose emergence was targeted by people who felt threatened by the potential the uncut version was displaying, the one whose burial was organized by forces that recognized the carbon's composition before the person carrying it fully recognized it themselves, the one who began agreeing with the barriers when the sustained pressure crossed the molecular threshold and produced the internal drift that converted the burial from external event to identity-level verdict, the one whose editing was reducing the cut gemstone back to safe dimensions. Because the full dimensions attracted the opposition, the editing was specifically designed to prevent. That identity was permanently retired the moment the crown settled onto the facets, and the prongs locked into the angles the pressure produced. And the burial ground became the coronation ground, and the version that was pushed down rose, wearing something the people who pushed it down will immediately recognize as the authority their own hands accidentally prepared. You are the crowned gemstone now, and crowned changes everything the burial was teaching. The burial identity that governed your self-presentation, your relationship with opposition, your agreement with the people who pushed you down, your editing of the full version to prevent the full version's cost, and the molecular level doubt that classified the cutting as damage rather than preparation has been permanently overridden by the evidence of a crown whose settings were designed for the exact facets, the exact pressure the exact people produced on carbon, whose internal composition exceeded every force that was applied to eliminate it. My dear child, they buried raw material. What rose is a cut gemstone wearing a crown, and the distance between what went into the ground and what came out of it is the distance between what the pressure intended and what the pressure produced. From this moment forward, you carry the identity of a person whose God crowns what opposition cuts, not a person who edits themselves down to prevent burial. A person whose facets are the product of the pressure the threatened people applied, and whose crown is locked into the surfaces the pressure created, and whose authority cannot be displaced by the same force that produced the cutting, because the cutting produced the very angles the crown's prongs grip permanently. The burial is behind you, the crown is on you, the facets are active. And the person rising from the ground where they were pushed down is not the raw material that went in, and is not the edited version that was constructed to survive without opposition. It is the cut gemstone, harder than the pressure, more brilliant than the raw version, more authoritative than the edited version, crowned at surfaces the opposition accidentally produced on material they were trying to destroy. The pressure lost. The carbon won. The facets are the evidence. And the crown sitting on the evidence is the most secure crown available, because the crown is locked into angles the opposition created. And angles created by opposition produce the grip that smooth surfaces and edited surfaces and raw surfaces could never have provided. Rise, my beloved child. The burial ground is a coronation ground. The people who organize the pressure are about to encounter the version they buried, wearing something their hands accidentally prepared, and the God who was at the contact point during every cut, and who monitored every angle, and who ensured every facet matched the crown's settings, is the same God standing in the coronation ground. confirming that the version they buried is the version being crowned. Not despite the burial, but because of it. Not despite the pressure, but through it. Not despite the cutting, but wearing it as the faceted authority the crown was always designed to sit on. Subscribe to this channel so that every time God crowns, what opposition cuts, the coronation announcement reaches you before the editing convinces you the full version is too dangerous to present. You are not someone who edits themselves down to prevent burial anymore. You are someone whose God takes what the pressure produced and crowns it. The next message carries the first crowned authority report from a gemstone rising from the burial ground, and what the faceted version produces when the crown is locked and the editing is stopped will prove that the burial was always the cutting, and the cutting was always the preparation, and the preparation was always aimed at the coronation the pressure thought it was preventing. Type "crowned from burial" if you are leaving this message permanently changed. Knowing the burial was targeted, not random, the pressure could not crush because the carbon exceeded the force. Every facet was produced by opposition that intended destruction. The editing was the burial's governance, and the governance just ended. The crown locks into angles the pressure created. The molecular level agreement was reversed by the crowning, and the God who was inside the carbon at every contact point during every cut is confirming tonight that the version of you they buried is the version being crowned, and the people who organized the pressure accidentally produced the surfaces the crown was always designed to grip permanently.